Hello. This is Rituals in the Dark, and it's gay as hell, apparently. And has like horror elements in it. It's a visual novel, so it's more reading again. I wish I could tell you that that will stop, but I actually don't know. Let me have a look to see what's next, because I'm just going down a list, honestly. I'm just going down a list. The next one is something I actually don't remember because I have so many things. I have so many things like ready to play all the time because obviously I have a massive fucking backlog and I don't remember what some things I get are, so anyway, we're gonna start. We're not gonna finish this today, just straight up. We're just gonna maybe do like one video. We'll do one video. Alright. Aspen Draper was probably one of the last people to see the elderly Miss Lee still alive, and she was definitely the first person to see her after she died. Miss Lee had lived next door to Aspen for as long as the teenage girl could remember, in her semi-detached house on Paradise Road. Paradise Road, despite its grandiose name, didn't live up to expectations. It was like any other street in Scarborough, really. Grey, cramped, and gently sloping down the side of a shallow hill. The pavement was usually littered with takeaway cartons from kebab houses. The bins never seemed to get emptied on time no matter how often Aspen's mother complained to the local council, and at night Aspen could often hear stray cats fighting, or worse, mating outside her window. Despite the street's numerous flaws, however, Miss Lee had lived there for almost all her life. Or, ever since I got married to Ivor, as she herself put it. Aspen had lived in Paradise Road all her life too, and though she'd met Miss Lee on many occasions, she'd never had the pleasure of speaking to her husband. Ivor had died before Aspen had been born. Miss Lee was old, though Aspen didn't know quite how old. Aspen presumed the woman must have been in her 70s or 80s, maybe even 90s, but it seemed rude to ask. The elderly Miss Lee was a mysterious creature with no fixed age. She had looked much the same to Aspen when she was 6 and when she was 16. If Miss Lee had changed at all over the decade, Aspen couldn't tell. Miss Lee exuded a constant aura of frailty and elderliness, an aura which was further compounded by her penchant for closing her blue, rheumy eyes and mumbling, "Back in my day." Aspen didn't know when exactly Mrs. Lay's day had been, but it must have been years and years ago. Decades even. It was certainly long before Aspen had been born, and it might have been before her parents had been born too. Miss Lee didn't seem to have any friends or family. Though Aspen had lived next to Miss Lee for 16, bordering on 17 years, she rarely saw cars that weren't Miss Lee's old, unused Nissan parked in the driveway. The car had probably belonged to Ivor when he was still alive. Maybe that was why Miss Lee never touched it. Could she even drive? The old woman seemed so very frail with her slender wrists and her slow, shuffling gait that Aspen doubted it. Aspen had never seen any children, grandchildren, nieces or nephews grace the doorstep of Miss Lee's home. It was just Miss Lee and occasionally the woman from the council called Rebecca, but call me Bex, who came around a few times a week to buy Miss Lee groceries and clean her kitchen. Thinking about it, Rebecca should have been the one to discover Miss Lee's body first. Surely that was her job. Rebecca was employed not only to aid the elderly woman in her twilight years, but to save any poor, wide-eyed, nail-biting neighborhood girls from stumbling upon Miss Lay's corpse during the winter months. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Rebecca hadn't shown up on that particular Sunday. Sunday was her day off. And Aspen had, and it had been Aspen who had found the body, not Rebecca. That's just how life goes. But to arrive at the point of Aspen finding Miss Lee's body, the old woman's eyes rolled up in her head and her mouth twisted from a sudden heart attack, we have to go back. Aspen had spent most of her life ignoring Miss Lee as best she could, though her mother had told her to smile and wave when she saw the old dear pottering around in her garden. That's what Aspen's mother called Miss Lee, the old dear, and Aspen supposed she was harmless enough. Privately, however, Aspen had always thought Miss Lee was a little creepy. Miss Lee was a small and shrunken creature, like a living specimen pickled in vinegar. Her hair was very thin and white, and it was often tied back in a bun that exposed a worrying amount of baby pink scalp. Her fingers, meanwhile, were gnarled like roots of a tree. Miss Lee would sometimes meander around in her front garden when the weather was nice and her joints were up to it. She'd finger the overgrown cluster of sweet peas in the pear trees that were even older and frailer than she was with a satisfied nod, as though the plants in her garden were supposed to be dying. Maybe Miss Lee was so old, her eyesight so poor, she simply couldn't see that her precious roses had been half devoured by caterpillars, her snapdragons and marigolds overrun by weeds. Or maybe she did know, but she knew she was too old to do anything about it. Miss Lee could hardly don a pair of gardening gloves and kneel down in the dirt at her age, whatever her age was. She'd throw her back out or dislocate a kneecap, and then she'd never be able to get back up again. Miss Lee seemed perfectly content to meander, nursing a mug of warm tea in her choppy fingers and a thick cardigan thrown over her shoulders, as she admired what had once been a pretty flower garden. When Miss Lee saw Aspen, typically on her way back home from primary school or ballet practice, she would smile and say how big she was getting. Aspen, who'd always been shy, would murmur words of thanks at her mother's behest, then hurry indoors, where Mrs. Lee's sad smile couldn't reach her. For many years, these were the only interactions the two had. But that changed on Aspen's 13th birthday when the old woman did something quite surprising. She bought Aspen a present. Well, bought might not have been the correct word. Miss Lee rarely went 3 paces past her front garden, and she certainly never went to Sainsbury's. That was Rebecca's job. Instead, Miss Lee wrapped one of her own little ornaments up in paper, put it inside a shoebox, and left it on the draper's doorstep with a card attached. The ornament was small and made of painted ceramic, though most of the paint had flaked away. It depicted a little girl in a leotard and tutu, her hair tied back with a ribbon, standing on point with her arms extended. One of the girl's hands had snapped off and her nose was broken, but it was a sweet gesture all the same. Aspen's father had been convinced the little ornament was worth a pretty penny, and he took it to an antique shop to be appraised, much to his wife's irritation. "I'm not going to sell it, Penny," Mr. Draper had tried to assure his wife. "This belongs to Aspen. I just want to satisfy my own curiosity. You never know, it could be something special." Aspen's father, incidentally, worked as a curator at the Scarborough Art Gallery. He spent his days examining works of art, and he had a vested interest in how old, and more importantly how expensive, little trinkets like Miss Lay's ballerina figure were. Unfortunately, a quick trip to the antique shop revealed that the ballerina was almost entirely worthless, and that is neither here nor there. The card Miss Lee left Aspen was decorated with an image of a young rosy-cheeked girl in a pale blue dress playing with a jump rope. The card was very pastel, almost washed out, and seemed to have come from another era, maybe the 1960s or 70s. Inside the card, Miss Lay had written in a faint and spidery hand, "Dear Althea." Miss Lee often got Aspen's name wrong. "I hope you like your present. I saw it and it reminded me of you. I know you practice ballet and I thought you might get more enjoyment out of it than I do. Love, Margaret." Up until that day, Aspen hadn't known what Miss Lee's first name was. She'd always called her Miss Lee. She'd never even stopped to consider that Miss Lee might have a first name at all. It seemed almost inconceivable. Miss Lee's name, Margaret, didn't really suit her. The name was too light and jaunty. It conjured up images of pretty, dark-haired girls in red, ruffled dresses dancing beneath the moonlight, not an elderly woman in frumpy clothes nodding benignly at clusters of worm-eaten and primroses. Maybe Miss Lee had been more like a Margaret in the past. Maybe her white hair had been dark and she had worn red ruffles and she had danced the night away. She must have been young and vivacious and full of life once upon a time. Maybe it had been when Ivor was still alive, however long ago that was. But Aspen couldn't imagine it. Aspen didn't want to call Miss Lee Margaret. For some reason, it made her feel sad. It felt too much like a wasted opportunity. Past time that would never ever come back. Miss Lee would always and would always be, was always and would always be, Miss Lee to Aspen. The revelation of Miss Lee's full name, however, was not the crucial takeaway from that letter. It was clear that, though Miss Lee and Aspen had only exchanged the briefest of greetings over the last 13 years, Miss Lee had been paying more attention to Aspen than she herself had ever realized. True, she had gotten Aspen's name wrong. Aspen was quite an unusual name, not very Yorkshire. Then again, neither was Althea. but Miss Lee knew enough about Aspen to know she took ballet classes. At least she had taken ballet classes. Aspen had quit when she started secondary school. Going to her lessons every Friday had been a painful experience. The ballet mistress, one Miss Preobrazhensky, I'm not even going to bother, who hailed from Russia and whose name Aspen could not pronounce, me too, girl, me too, was very strict, and if she was bad, the other girls were worse. Aspen had attended ballet class from the age of 5, with the childish dream of someday being a dancer. I also used to take ballet. And you know what? I may have even lived in Scarborough. Maybe. I'm trying to remember. I may have lived there. Okay, that's weird. The young girl soon learnt, however, that she was not, and would never be as charming, flexible, or beautiful as the other little swans. She just didn't have the knack. Aspen had already given up on her dancing dreams when Miss Lee bequeathed her that tiny ballerina, but it was a thoughtful gift nevertheless. "It was very kind of her," said Aspen's mother, Penny. "You should go over to her house and thank her." Aspen hadn't wanted to go to Miss Lee's house and thank her. She would have rather stuck her fingers in the toaster. "Now, don't be like that," Penny said, tutting. "Miss Lee is an old, lonely woman. She needs some company, and she did send you a gift. You should show a bit of appreciation." Aspen's mother could be quite assertive when she wanted, and the young girl knew there was no getting around her. She had to go and visit Miss Lee, and so she did. One Sunday morning, with her hair neatly braided, wearing a blue gingham dress, Aspen walked through Miss Lee's overgrown front garden and knocked on her door. She intended to say a quick thank you for the gift and bolt, but Miss Lee had other ideas. With a small smile betraying just the slightest twinge of discomfort, Miss Lee had arthritis and even smiling seemed to hurt her, the old woman ushered Aspen inside. What could she do? Refuse. If she had, Penny, who was always anxious about maintaining good relationships with the neighbours, would have flayed her, though Aspen, hesitant though she was, stepped inside. When Miss Lee closed the wooden front door behind her, Aspen couldn't help but feel like one of the children from Hansel and Gretel. Was Miss Lee going to lock her in a cage, cook her in an oven? But Aspen never met such a grotesque end. Miss Lee struggled to pick up her reading glasses, let alone 13-year-old girls. There was no way she could have crammed Aspen into her oven, and anyway, it wasn't big enough. This was no fairy tale, and Miss Lee's designs were of a far less sinister nature than any wicked witch. She just wanted somebody to talk to. And that was how Aspen became Miss Lee's unwilling confidant. Almost every Sunday, rain or shine, Aspen would show up at Miss Lee's house for a mid-morning tea. Miss Lee's fingers trembled something awful and her movements were slow and shuffling, but she always insisted on making the tea herself. Not content to serve Aspen the same blends every visit, she instructed Rebecca to buy all sorts of different leaves during her big Saturday shop at the nearby Tesco. Sitting in one of the overstuffed armchairs in Miss Lee's living room, which was strangely uncomfortable despite being piled high with cushions, Aspen would sample teas of varying flavours. It's kind of nice to have something that I'm reading be set in a place where I am, where I know what they're talking about. I don't know, it's nice. The tea was often served with biscuits or chocolates, pink wafers, ginger nuts, custard creams, chocolate fingers, or bourbons. Bourbons are amazing. Chocolate fingers are also great. Pink wafers, they can kind of not taste of anything sometimes. Ginger nuts, I don't like ginger, outside of soups. Custard creams are fine, good with tea. Yeah, see, I know all of these. Miss Lee never ate any of the biscuits herself. She laughed and said she was on a diet. That didn't stop her from plying her young guest with sweets, though, and Aspen was too worried about upsetting her to say no. Her tongue burning from the too hot tea, Aspen tried to drink it as quickly as possible, and her stomach churning from too much chocolate, Aspen would sit there and let Miss Lee talk. Miss Lee talked about a large number of things during her visits, but Aspen could never remember much of it. Miss Lee talked about people Aspen had never met, all of them dead, buried, and places Aspen had never been to. Sometimes Miss Lee managed to get Aspen's name right, but more often than not, she called her Althea. And the whole while, Aspen, who began to wonder if she wasn't called Althea after all, sat there and smiled. The clock ticked slowly, counting away the seconds, minutes, and hours Aspen would never get back. If Miss Lee knew Aspen wasn't particularly interested in their tete-a-tetes, I can't remember how to say that one, she never gave any indication of it. Maybe she was too lost in her own reminiscences to realize how uncomfortable she made her young guest, or maybe she was so blind she simply couldn't see. Either way, regardless of Aspen's personal feelings, those sad and somber tea parties continued for several years. This routine, more familiar than clockwork, eventually came to an end, however, and it came to an end in the most gruesome manner 3 years later, one January morning. It had been unpleasantly cold during the winter. According to the news, they were going through a cold snap. Icy winds blew in from the sea, and the wind howled despairingly in the night. Aspen walked to school wearing 2 sweatshirts beneath her coat, but it made little difference. By the time she got to her classroom, her fingers felt so frozen she worried they might shatter. She had 2 school sweatshirts? Alright. Aspen's visits to Miss Lee didn't abate during this cold period. Though Aspen felt chilled to the bone, Miss Lee seemed to be doing well for herself, as well as a woman of indeterminate. Oh my god. Okay, it's almost 2 a.m. I'm bloody tired. This is always going to be my excuse, and to be honest, it's fucking true this time though. That's why I'm only doing the one video today. Of indeterminate age could do, at least. Miss Lee didn't look any sicker than she usually did, and though she complained that her arthritis was playing up, these were the same complaints Aspen had heard for the last 3 years. Aspen didn't pay it any heed, not until one particular visit. Aspen sat on Miss Lee's brown couch in her equally brown living room, which smelt, strangely enough, of chopped liver, her hands in her lap. Outside, the wind howled. Miss Lee was in the kitchen. She'd gone to brew the tea and plate up the biscuits, as per her normal routine. Aspen had offered to help, but Miss Lee waved this small act of kindness aside. "Very kind of you, dear," she'd said, "but I'm not infirm just yet. I can take care of myself. You sit down and read a magazine." Obedient to a fault, Aspen sat down, but she didn't read a magazine. Miss Lee was subscribed to Woman's Weekly and Women at Home, neither of which Aspen found riveting. Instead, Aspen watched the clock. The minutes slowly passed. 1, then 2, then 5. Still, Miss Lee did not come back from the kitchen. Though Miss Lee often took her time brewing the tea and plating the biscuits, she did have her arthritis to contest with. She didn't normally take that long. Aspen wouldn't have been so troubled if she could have heard the sounds of the old kettle brewing or the cupboard slamming, but everything was curiously quiet. So Aspen got to her feet, her heart pounding with trepidation. Already she knew something was wrong, and exited the living room. She walked through the hallway, sidestepping an old pair of Miss Lee's slippers and a little wooden table topped with a chunky telephone, and made her way to the kitchen. "Miss Lee?" she said softly, questioningly. "Miss Lee?" But there was no reply. Aspen stood by the kitchen door, which was closed. She felt sick. At that moment, she already knew, via some deep primordial instinct that lays dormant inside each and every one of us, that if she opened that door, there would be no going back. Her life would never be the same again. But Aspen shook her head. She told herself, like we so often tell ourselves when we know something to be true, not with facts, but with our own intuition, that she was being silly. And so she opened the door. What Aspen saw that day stayed with her ever since, like a birthmark. The old-fashioned kettle had finished boiling and steam was slowly rising from the spout. 2 mugs had been set on the counter, already filled with tea leaves. They were ready to receive the warm water from the kettle, but no water was forthcoming. A plate of biscuits lay by the mugs. Miss Lee had prepared jammy dodgers. The jam looked so very red and artificial beneath the yellow lights it was almost nauseating. And as for Miss Lee herself, she was sitting, though perhaps sitting isn't the right word, at the kitchen table. She was leant back in her chair, fingers resting on the tabletop and her cardigan half falling off one shoulder, and she was quite still. She was so still Aspen would have supposed she was sleeping, save for one crucial detail. Her eyes were wide open. Her eyes were open so wide that they were almost bulging out of her head. Miss Lee's milky blue irises were rolled upwards, revealing a worrying amount of white, and her head was lolling. Her mouth was open too. Her face was contorted into a frightening silent scream, but no noise would come from her mouth. She was dead. It was a heart attack, the doctors said when they arrived on the scene. It had been a quiet, understated kind of death, all things considered. The old woman hadn't made a single sound. Miss Lee, while preparing the plate of biscuits, must have felt a stab of pain inside her chest. Accustomed to such aches and pains, she was an old woman after all, she'd sat down at the kitchen table and waited for the pain to pass. Miss Lee hadn't tried to get Aspen's attention, though perhaps the thought had flitted through her mind. She hadn't wanted to worry her guest. Maybe Miss Lee had always known, though she never admitted it, that Aspen found their weekly tea parties a chore. The old woman was aware she was imposing on the young girl, but how could she help herself? Aspen was the only company she had other than Rebecca. Miss Lee hadn't wanted to cause more trouble than she had already, so she'd sat there, her body racked with pain while the kettle brewed, and very silently and very politely passed away. All things considered, it was quite a British way to go. True. Maybe one could even have called it noble. Brave, heroic. But the thought of Miss Lee suffering silently, too anxious to ask Aspen for help, only made the young girl feel even guiltier. If only she could have done something. But Aspen had done nothing, and by the time she'd realized something was amiss, it was already too late. That was the first time Aspen had seen a dead body outside of scenes in detective dramas or movies. She hoped it would be the last. Unfortunately, none of her classmates or even her friends would ever let her live it down. Why? Cue artwork. So, did it really happen next door? That's right. That's where you found her body? Yeah. Ew, how creepy. Pippa glanced about Aspen's bedroom, which was joined, though separated by a lilac wall, to what had once been Miss Lee's house. How does it feel living next to a place where a body was found? It doesn't feel like anything, really. Oh, come on, it has to feel like something. Doesn't it creep you out? Not particularly. Have you ever heard any strange noises at night? What kinds of strange noises? Oh, I don't know. Wailing, crying, anything like that? No. Have you ever stepped into any cold patches of air or felt shivers run down your spine? Well, Aspen thought for a moment in a half-hearted attempt to oblige her friend, then shook her head. Wow. Aspen was being fairly reticent, but Pippa looked impressed all the same. She whistled beneath her breath. It's still seriously creepy. I'd be so freaked out if I had to live next to a spooky old house like that. Spooky. Valkii? I really don't know how to pronounce that name. Valkii raised a neatly plucked eyebrow. This isn't a horror movie and we're not little kids. I know, but it's the thought of it. Can you imagine? Aspen bit her lower lip. She didn't need to imagine. She'd already seen Miss Lay's body. Pippa hadn't. Maybe that was why she sounded so gleeful about the whole sorry affair. Her house looks so run down too. The garden's a mess and the windows are all boarded up. I guess nobody's moved in yet? I don't think anybody would want to. It would be quite a hard sell for even the most charismatic of real estate agents. And here we have the kitchen. It's located near the back of the house, away from the road. It's got windows looking out into the garden, a refrigerator, a washing machine, and an oven. And if you look to your right, that's where the previous occupant was found, stone cold dead at the breakfast table. It really makes you think about the briefness of life, doesn't it? It's a short candle. They just have to disclose that someone died there and it was of old age. They don't have to be like, oh, they died right there at the breakfast table. I'm pretty sure they don't have to do that. So the months went by and nobody moved into Miss Lee's house, except the squatters. The squatters broke in through the windows. They probably stole most of the stuff inside the house. None of Miss Lee's possessions had been moved. She had no relatives to collect them, and she hadn't left a will. The squatters banged about in Miss Lee's home until the early hours of the morning, and made such a racket that Aspen's mother complained to the local council. Call the fucking police. If someone's breaking into a house that's not theirs, you call the fucking police. This is already baffling my mind. The council got the house boarded up, but that was about it. Whatever remained of Miss Lee's belongings, her lavender stuffed cushions and her little china figures and her floral rugs that smelt strangely musky, were still shut up inside, waiting for an owner who would never return. The garden, which had brought Miss Lee such joy, was now deader than ever, if such a thing was possible. The weeds had overrun the snapdragons and stifled the marigolds, and the roses were more holes than flowers. But despite that, life continued on. It continued on for girls like Valkii and Pippa, at least, who were completely divorced from the memory of Miss Lee's sightless eyes and twisted mouth. But it didn't for Aspen. Not properly. How could it when whenever Aspen closed her eyes, she saw the image of Miss Lee's dead body beneath her lids like a grotesque tattoo? Pippa leant forwards, her voice dropping to a whisper. And what was it like seeing it? How did it make you feel? Valkii, who had disdain down to a fine art, wrinkled her nose. I bet it was disgusting. Look, you guys. Aspen shifted on the edge of her bed, fingers linked together. Her bare right foot twitched against the carpet. I don't want to talk about it. Why not? We're your friends, aren't we? We are friends, but... You don't need to tell anybody else, but you can tell us. Scout's honor. You've never once been a scout. It's a figure of speech. Well, I can't really remember. It was more than 5 months ago. Liar. What? People don't just forget things like that. At least I wouldn't. Too bad we're not all geniuses like you, Valkii. I am not a genius. I just bothered to study for my exams unlike a certain somebody. Oh, get you. You're so la-di-da. It was dark outside, beyond Aspen's drawn curtains, and the 3 girls were sitting on the edge of Aspen's bed in their pajamas. While Aspen and Pippa were dressed demurely, Valkii was attired in something a little more revealing. Valkii's nightwear, if it could be called as such, was a very sheer nightgown with thin straps that shone pearl white beneath the dim glow of Aspen's bedside lamp. Aspen wondered if it wasn't too cold in Scarborough, which was by the seafront, to wear such skimpy clothes, but perhaps Valkii's body was attuned to the warmth of Indian summers, despite the fact her parents had moved to England when she was still a child. It wasn't yet midnight and the 3 girls wouldn't be going to sleep for several more hours. That was how sleepovers worked. There was rarely, if ever, any sleep involved. But Valkii had insisted that they change into their nightwear as soon as 10 o'clock came around. Valkii said she felt more comfortable in her pajamas, but Aspen privately thought she just wanted to show off her new nightgown. Almost all of Valkii's things were new. Her family was rich, and she had no qualms about flaunting it. Valkii flaunted quite a lot, thought Aspen, as she surreptitiously admired her friend's slender legs. Oh, come on, Aspen. Pippa, Aspen's more stereotypically British friend, who had perpetually flushed cheeks and ginger hair, pouted. We've been really nice to you about this whole thing. I mean, we didn't get on your case too much when you found that old lady, did we? I just wanted to give it a bit more Britishness, like the narration said. But I won't do that forever, though. Just that one line. Maybe not, but everybody else did. Aspen hung her head. Her dark hair fell in front of her eyes, obscuring her face. After Aspen found the body of Miss Lee, she became something of a local celebrity. Aspen hadn't told anybody about her discovery, but the news had travelled fast. Jenny's mother worked at the local hospital. She'd been one of the first people to hear about Miss Lee's fate. Jenny's mother had told Jenny all about the awful affair, and how traumatizing it must have been for everyone involved. It wouldn't have been half as traumatic if Jenny's mother had adhered to basic confidentiality clauses. Jenny told Anna, and Anna told Lucy, and Lucy, being Lucy, told the world. When Aspen returned to school on Monday, a wiser but a sadder girl, she was suddenly thrust into the unwanted, unasked-for role of a celebrity. Everybody wanted to know what finding a dead body had been like. They wanted precise details, right down to the volume of saliva trickling from Miss Lee's open mouth. Aspen, who'd always been a bit on the awkward side, a wallflower if you will, had shied away from these queries. She didn't like being in the spotlight at the best of times, and she certainly didn't enjoy reliving those sickening seconds when she had stumbled upon Miss Lee's body at the breakfast table. If she had to be famous for something, she'd rather be famous for being funny and audacious like Pippa, or beautiful and clever like Valkii. But Aspen wasn't funny and audacious. She certainly wasn't beautiful, and though her grades were good, they weren't as good as Valkii's. Aspen was quiet and softly spoken, and she rarely raised her hand in class even when she knew the answer to a question. It didn't seem worth the effort. In lieu of having any real abilities or any noteworthy achievements, Aspen became famous for finding a corpse. It wasn't much of a claim to fame. In fact, the whole thing was quite depressing. The hubbub surrounding Aspen died down within a few weeks once her classmates realized it would be easier to pry juicy gossip from Miss Lee's cold blue lips than Aspen's, but a faint undercurrent of intrigue remained. From that day forth, Aspen knew she'd never be regarded as Asper Draper anymore, not even among her teachers. She was, and always would be, the girl who discovered a dead body. 6 months had passed since then, but Aspen still couldn't escape from the ghostly memory of Miss Lee. Won't you tell us what she looked like? I want to know. I don't want to think about it. But if you don't tell us, I'll spend the whole night thinking about it, and then I won't get any sleep. It's the uncertainty that kills me. Aspen didn't reply. Instead, she ducked her head, idly tracing patterns on her bedspread. To Aspen, it was the certainty that really unsettled her. She could try and explain it, but somehow she didn't think Pippa would understand. It was a little like the Thestrals in Harry Potter. Aspen mused she had taken great comfort in her favourite childhood books after finding Miss Lee's body. Death only made sense to people unfortunate enough to see it, while those who hadn't could never hope to understand how frighteningly real it was. Well, you're no fun. Pippa pouted and folded her arms as if talking about a dead woman could ever be fun, and by remaining silent, Aspen had cruelly robbed her of a diverting amusement. I'm sorry. Aspen apologized, her head bowed, because she didn't know what else to say. What was there to say? Well, it's only 11. We need to do something fun to pass the time. Pippa pondered for a few moments, tapping a finger against her lower lip before... Ah! Her eyes lit up. Maybe we should play a game. I don't want to play any of your silly games. I could chip a nail. It won't be a silly game, Valkii. It'll be really mature, I promise. Since Aspen's parents aren't here, we can really go all out. What do you mean, exactly? I mean, Pippa drummed her fingers against the bedside table, perhaps in an attempt to build anticipation. We should play Truth or Dare, and we will play Truth or Dare the next time I play this game. So I will see you in the next video. Bye!